Tonight we jump into a brand new series. It's called Ghosts Upon the Earth. It's a series that wrestles with the big questions around mental health. If you were with us this morning, then we started this series as well in our Sunday morning community, and it's one that we've now done 2 years in a row around these big questions of fear and anxiety and depression. And through this series in January, the questions of burnout, the questions of stress, and the issues of things like exhaustion that we know so very well. But first we have to ask this question: why do a series on mental health at all? See, this is a really difficult topic for us, isn't it? There's a lot of stigma around mental health issues. There's so much stigma around it in the Western world as we know it today that at the end of every January every year, I don't know if you know, the phone company Bell does something called Bell Let's Talk. And it's a campaign to raise awareness around mental health issues. Imagine how hard it is for us to talk about it, that we actually need a campaign in order to just get us in the door. But here at the platform, we want to be a community that talks about the kind of things that you don't usually talk about in church. And so last year in our Sunday morning community, we walked through things like fear and anxiety and depression. This year, as I said, instead we're going to be actually looking at things that are maybe more symptomatic of our culture at large. Maybe things that are actually at the heart of so much of the mental health issues of our time, because they're things around burnout and stress and exhaustion. There's a disease called Morgellons disease. You probably haven't heard of it, but thousands of people around the world suffer with something called Morgellons disease. If you have heard of it, sorry, because this is going to be super awkward for you. But Morgellons disease is known by the more common vernacular, the itch. Hence why it's going to be awkward for me to talk about it. It's called the itch. Now, the itch is a syndrome that people have all over the world, which is a perpetual sensation of itching just beneath the surface of your skin. And no matter how much you scratch yourself all over, you never quite assuage that feeling of itchiness. Now, if you were to look up Morgellons disease, even though thousands upon thousands of people suffer with it all around the world, in any medical journal, you'd find one word scratched next to it, and it's this: psychosomatic. Psychosomatic is a fancy medical term that means it's all in your head. There is nothing physically happening with people with Morgellons disease that actually causes itching. It's simply something going on in their head. Now, why do I tell you that? Well, because I want to ask you a question. For someone suffering with Morgellons disease, someone who has the itch, is it any less real for them? Is the pain in any way assuaged or set at bay because they find out that it's just in their head? Is it any less real because it's in their head? If you've ever personally struggled with issues of mental health, or you know someone who has, then you might have been on the receiving end of that easy diagnosis where people tell you it's all in your head. Maybe you've heard someone say, can't you just get over it? Can't you just suck it up? Or maybe, hey, everyone has a bad day once in a while. Everybody gets down sometimes. Or maybe you've heard people say, just cheer up. Have you tried just cheering up, honestly, like having a nice cup of tea and getting on with life? Those are the kind of easy, reductive answers that people who suffer with mental health issues constantly come against and hear. And often, it's also the answer that we give to ourselves, isn't it? Often it's the way that we self-medicate if we're suffering with these kind of mental health issues. Maybe you've suffered with something like stress. Maybe you've gone through that exam period in school and you know what it is to feel exhaustion and burnout, and you've self-medicated by telling yourself, once this exam is over, once I get this paper in, once this project's finished, once this work project is all completed, or maybe even if you've got kids, once they're grown up and they're in school and they're not in the house anymore, then everything will get better. And the problem is that easy, reductive answer does nothing to solve the problem, does it? Just because you discover that maybe somehow it's all in your head, that doesn't make any difference at all. And that's why with this conversation over the next few weeks, you're not going to hear easy answers. You're not going to hear any easy answers to impossible questions about mental health. And you're also not going to hear Christian answers to these problems, okay? You're not going to hear anyone stand up here and say, if you just pray about it, everything will go away. Maybe if you're suffering with mental health, it's because you don't have enough faith. You're not going to hear those kind of easy, reductive answers here. What we are going to do, though, is just ask the question. Instead of giving an answer, what if we just step back and say, hey, how did we get here? And by here, I mean, how did we get to a place as a culture and as a people in which mental health issues are not just something that people struggle with behind closed doors, they are an epidemic that affects so many people. How did we get here? So before we jump in any further tonight, I'm going to give you guys 6 or 7 minutes to wrestle through these two questions. The first one as a little bit of an icebreaker, and then the second to really dive into. What things cause you the most stress? Spoiler alert, Calgary traffic is going to come up on every table, so I'll just get it out of the way now, all right? And then secondly, to what extent are stress and burnout circumstances existing outside of our control, or to what extent are they feelings within our ability to change? To what extent are they out there somewhere affecting us, and to what extent are they just all in your head? So I'm going to give you guys 6 or 7 minutes to wrestle through those, and then we're going to be right back. So yeah, historically, every age has been marked by one signature affliction. If you look at the 14th century, it's the Black Plague. If you look at the 20th century, particularly around World War I, then it's influenza, the common flu that sweeps across Europe and North America and kills hundreds of thousands of people. If you look to the 1970s, 80s, this new disease develops called HIV/AIDS, which we know very, very well because it really devastated the world at the end of the 20th century. Often an affliction becomes definitive of a society because it kind of tells you something about that society's unique brand of brokenness, doesn't it? Let me give you an example of this. In the first century world, when Jesus was around, what was the signature affliction, the one he was constantly running up against? Leprosy. Oh, you guys actually were going to answer. Sorry, it was rhetorical, but thanks. I think someone got it wrong because you didn't say leprosy. But anyway, it was leprosy, okay? Leprosy was that word. It was kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different skin ailments in the first century. But it becomes definitive of that culture. Why? Because the Hebrews are a culture that is based entirely around purity. Everything's about keeping yourself pure before a holy God and a holy chosen people of God. And so the most impure thing, a skin ailment that is so contagious that if you get within 6 feet of it, so they believed, you'll contract it, becomes definitive of that society. They're defined by purity, and so what do they do with impurity? They push it out to the margins of society. And our signature syndrome is mental health. Let me ask you this. Why is it that mental health issues are uniquely Western phenomena? As I said, why is it that the most successful, wealthiest, ambitious, progressive society in human history is also the one that is caught in this epidemic of depression and anxiety and fear and stress and burnout? Why is it? A guy whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce, but he's Asian, says this: Achievement society, I'm guessing, achievement society is the society of self-exploitation. The achievement subject exploits itself until it burns out. Achievement society is the society of self-exploitation. We live in an achievement-oriented society. We live in a place in which your value is entirely predicated on what you can get done, on what you can achieve, on what you can succeed at, on what you can contribute better and brighter than anybody else. And in that kind of society, the inevitable result of living according to that vision of life is what? Burnout. It's the inevitable end of living according to the vision of life offered in our culture. I don't know if you've ever been in ministry, but if you have, then you know what it is to be a pastor in a church on a Sunday morning. You meet lots of people. And the usual rigmarole goes like this. I see someone coming towards me, I've forgotten their name, but they keep coming, and then they say, hey, and then so I pretend that I know their name, but then it's okay because I realize they also have forgotten my name, so we just keep calling each other brother and, friend, how's it going? And it's just super awkward until one of us says, I can't remember your name. But inevitably it gets to this point in the conversation. So how was your week? And what's the inevitable answer? It was busy. It was pretty busy. So what I started doing with kind of getting bored with the same rigmarole of conversation every Sunday morning was I started challenging myself to find more imaginative answers to that question, just to see if I could bear giving a different answer than I'm busy. And so I started saying to people, they'd say, how was your week? And I'd say, it's pretty easy. Wasn't very busy. And it's so uncomfortable to say that. And then I sort of raised the stakes and be like, honestly, pretty lazy. I have literally done nothing since last Sunday but sit on the couch. And it gets kind of awkward. But the reason I tell you that is I want to ask you a question. Could you ever answer that like that? If someone says to you, how was your week? How are you doing? How hard would it be for you to say, it was easy? It wasn't busy. It wasn't full. The reason I ask you that question is this, because if you couldn't answer like that without a little hint of pain to your pride, then you might be a victim of a burnout culture. You might be a victim of an achievement-oriented culture, the kind that creates the syndromes that define our lives every day. Did you know that leprosy is actually still around in the world? Not everybody knows this. Leprosy is still around. It's not huge, but it affects quite a number of cultures. And it exists distinctly and predominantly in purity-based cultures. That's really interesting, isn't it? Leprosy has been eradicated almost completely from the Western world. There's still some very small homes that care for lepers in America. I don't know about Canada. But mostly it exists in cultures based around the idea of purity. Why? Because those kind of cultures cannot get close enough to people afflicted with leprosy to actually do anything about it. They can't cure it, so instead they contain it. And when you look at our signature syndromes like burnout and stress and exhaustion, they are emblematic of our achievement-based culture, which means we don't seek to cure them, do we? Nobody seeks to cure stress and exhaustion. What do? We contain them. We use them. Maybe even we celebrate those kind of illnesses. Which means you have to ask yourself the question, how are we ever supposed to move toward a cure for illnesses whose symptoms we celebrate? Now, I told you with this series, we're not going to offer easy answers to impossible questions. And the reason we're not going to do that is because that is not where Scripture starts. The scriptural imagination that we want to get into in a few minutes has a radically different way of diagnosing the problem of mental health issues, particularly those of stress and burnout and exhaustion. And it has a radically different kind of prescription for the problem to move you towards a solution. And so I want to spend a few minutes looking around this story in the Old Testament. If you've been in church any time at all, you probably know it. It's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, and I think it has something profound to say to us about how we deal with living in a burnout culture. It goes like this. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he'd killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I don't make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life into the desert. He came to a tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and he ate and he drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face. He went out and he stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah? Go back the way you came." So suffice it to say, to sum up that story, Elijah's had a long day. He's had a bad day. Elijah is the last prophet of Israel left against a new king called Ahab and his horrible wife Jezebel. Okay, all the other prophets in Israel have turned to a false god called Baal, and Elijah's the only one left. So just in the chapter before this one, what Elijah does is he says, right, let's have a boxing match, okay? Me versus all of you. There's 800 prophets in Israel. All of them have turned to this false god, and Elijah beats them all at their own game. And so it's fair to say that he's a little tuckered out. I think that's the North American phrase. We say knackered, but I don't think you guys really know what that means. He's pretty knackered. He's pretty shattered, all right? I'm just going to use this platform to update your British vernacular as much as I can, in case you haven't realized that's my real reason for doing this thing. So in the ancient world, when people were knackered, there was a place that they used to run to. a place to escape the seductive compulsions and competitiveness of the prevailing culture they lived in, and it was the desert. A place of solitude, a place they could be by themselves, a place of silence where maybe, just maybe, they could hear the voice of God. That kind of longing for silence and solitude, maybe that's familiar to you. Maybe you know what it is to long for one small few minutes of silence and solitude in your busy schedule. And if it is familiar to you, then it's probably because at some point in your life, you have also echoed Elijah's words of burnout. I have had enough. I have had enough. Another translation says, it's enough now. It's just enough now. Does that resonate with you at all? Now, I'm breaking the golden rule here of preaching. I don't know if you know the golden rule, but it's that you're not supposed to talk about things that you're still struggling with. I don't know if you know that. You're not supposed to do that. There's a very good idea that actually if other people are struggling with something, let's say if they have a wound in their life, you're not supposed to show them your open wound and go, yeah, I'm with you, brother. We're both suffering the same way. What you're supposed to do is say, hey, I've walked through this. Show them your scar where their wound is, and they'll know that they can be healed. You're not supposed to share that you're still struggling with stuff. But unfortunately, as I work on a message on stress and burnout and exhaustion, I'm aware that it's kind of ironic because this has been my experience for the last couple of months. Between a heavier workload at work, between the ongoing paperwork of trying to become a resident in your fair country. If any of you know anyone, by the way, who can put in a good word, like Trudeau. I don't know if anyone knows Trudeau. But anyway, it's a long process. And then on top of that, I started my master's this last January. So anyway, all that to say, I felt a little stressed. I felt a little overwhelmed like many of us do lots of times in life. I've struggled to sleep, and that's been a new piece for me too. And the reason I tell you that is because I want us to make a deal with this conversation over the next few weeks. And the deal is this. I want us to agree that it's okay to not be okay. I want us to agree that if we're going to talk about stuff like burnout and mental health issues, then we have to first lay the groundwork of saying it is okay to not be okay here. Let me challenge you this way. Don't bring only a part of yourself into church and into community. Don't leave all the stressful bits waiting for you when you get back home so that you can just come here and pretend for an hour and a half on a Sunday night that everything's okay. No, bring your whole self. Bring yourself into this space so that we can work through these things together. Because you and I know that we don't like to admit that we're struggling with things, do we? It shows people that we're weak, that we can't handle the rat race, that we're not quite up to the task. In a world in which we have these celebrated addictions like perfectionism and workaholism, it becomes incredibly hard to acknowledge that we're not doing well. And so instead of acknowledging that maybe this moment in my life is actually too much for me, and maybe I should just stop or step back for a minute, instead what do? We self-medicate so that we can carry on the rat race a little bit longer. We buy books called things like Stress Management or The Power of Positive Thinking. Those kind of ideologies are burnout culture's form of self-medication. They're a way of saying you're running around like headless chickens is a good thing, and here's a way that you can keep doing it for a little bit longer, that you can get through your Monday so that you can live till Tuesday. And the ancient wisdom of Scripture offers us a radically different way. It says this: the journey is too much for you. The journey is too much for you. Because Elijah comes to God and he says, this is too much for me. I've had enough. It's enough now. And God doesn't say, just cheer up. Just feel better. It's all in your head after all. Just get on with it. Don't worry, tomorrow's another day. No, what does he say? What does he say? He says the most hopeful word you can possibly hear in those kinds of moments. He says yes. God comes to Elijah in his most burnt out moment and says, yes, the journey is too much for you. Not, well, it could be worse. Not, well, you should look at that guy over there because he's way busier than you, and that's why he's more successful than you. Not tomorrow's another day. No, the journey is too much for you. See, in our modern world of self-help and self-medication, it's become quite hard to be a pastor. It used to be the case that people in ministry had all the answers. We call them the glory days, right? And now that's not without its problems, But it used to be about 200 years ago that if you have a problem with mental health, finances, family life, stress, whatever it is, who do you go to? You go to the pastor. But now the modern world has made it so that any answer you or I give to the problems in our world and our lives, they threaten to be lost in the saturation of so-called answers and solutions and 7-step programs. And so instead, Jesus followers become kind of like public relations people, competing in the marketplace of ideas to say our idea is better than theirs. And that's why the Christian answer to the questions that plague our world, like burnout and stress and exhaustion, is singularly unique. The Christian answer is actually unlike any other answer. Why? Because it isn't, first and foremost, a solution. First and foremost, it is a raw and ugly and unfiltered and unafraid diagnosis of the root of the problem. See, maybe you sit here tonight and you're going, here we go. Here's another pastor, another person in ministry, another Christian who's going to tell me how easy it is to solve my problems. All I have to do is believe in God. That sure, I'm burnt out. Sure, I suffer with mental health issues, but I just need to believe in God. I just need to pray. I just need to have faith. But actually, the unique thing about Christianity, when it's done well, is that it's the only faith tradition and philosophy and ideology that looks the brokenness in the world square in the face and admits that that's the way things are. That looks at your pain and says, yes, the journey is too much for you. So we can look at Buddhism that tell you to negate your pain, that it's just an illusion. Pain and brokenness don't really exist, so you just need to find a way past that to enlightenment. Or you can look at the trend of new atheism, which means you kind of self-medicate by just finding people to blame for stuff. Usually that's the religious. So it doesn't matter if there's brokenness because it's all the fault of those Christians. Or you can turn to new age self-spiritualities that say, turn inward and you'll find this peace that is untouched by the brokenness of the world. Or you can turn to liberal politics who say, here's how you fix the problem. This is how you fix it. It doesn't matter if it's broken because we can make it right again. And into all of that saturation of ideas comes Christianity. And before it offers a solution, it offers a raw and unfiltered diagnosis that says the world is broken. It's more broken than you know it is. And each of us, you and me, is both a product of the brokenness, but also a participant in the brokenness. Christianity comes along and it doesn't offer you an easy one-size-fits-all answer to your problem. It doesn't sell you a 7-step program. So you come to God and say, it's too much for me. And he responds by simply saying, yes, it is too much for you. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, and he went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Earthquakes and wind and fire. It's a pretty good picture of contemporary life, isn't it? Let's sort of amend the text a little bit to say life is noisy. Life is turbulent. It shakes us up. It burns us up. In the modern vernacular, Elijah was shattered by life, but he couldn't find God in the noise. He was shaken to the core by life, but he couldn't find God in the stress and the frenzy of his schedule. He was burned up by everything that he had to do, but he couldn't find God in his burnout. He found God where? In the sound of sheer silence. Another translation says it like this: a still, small voice. Have you ever found yourself thinking, I've just got to make it through today? If I just make it through this paper and project and family crisis, then tomorrow I will have space and silence. I'll have a pocket of rest to keep me going. And so we keep pushing forward with that kind of a false hope without ever taking a breath somewhere, sometime. We just keep going because we trust that one day we'll find space. But God was not in the earthquake. He wasn't in the busyness and the hustle and the burnout. He was in the sound of sheer silence. See, the only thing we know for sure is that the solution to your burnout and your stress and your exhaustion is not to keep going. It isn't to just fill the schedule with other things, even if those are leisure things. That the way I can feel better about my busy schedule is to pocket in a trip to Banff to go skiing from 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. so that I can be back on Saturday night ready for church in the morning. That isn't the solution to your burnout. The solution to your burnout is found somewhere in the negative space. In the negative space where you might just start to rediscover parts of your soul that you forgot you had. And maybe you're sat here tonight and saying, this doesn't resonate for me at all, because I've never had the experience of a still small voice in the silence. But I want to invite you this week, if this doesn't resonate for you, or if it does, to try stillness, to try seeing what happens if you sit in the silence for a moment. I'm not offering you a solution. It doesn't mean that your Monday morning you're going to wake up like George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life and just spring out of bed ready to go whistling a merry tune, dancing around. No. But you might just hear a voice that you haven't heard before. A still small voice that maybe you don't know. Maybe you haven't heard it. Maybe you don't even know about this God thing. But maybe you're sat here thinking, I do need to hear the truth and the hope that this journey is too much for me. And that's okay. As we come into land, this is the way that Jesus puts it when he speaks to people in their tiredness and burnout. You saw it on the video already. Let's read it again. Are you tired, worn down, burned out? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me. Work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and rightly. God's words to Elijah end in a really surprising way, just like Jesus's. He doesn't say, hey, just stop here and rest for the rest of your life. Just stay here in the silence and never go back into that chaotic world that you come from. He says the exact opposite. He ends with these words, what are you doing here, Elijah? Go back the way you came. That somehow the word that follows on the heels of this journey is too much for you is rest and then go back. Go back into the journey that proved too much for you then because now you've rested. See, once Elijah's done resting, he says, go back the way you came. Be a prophetic voice into a culture that still doesn't know how to rest like you just did. Be a prophetic voice into a burnout culture, into a frantic and burned out people. Show the world a better way of being. A way of being in which your value is not predicated on your achievement and success and how hard you work to get to the top of the ladder. It's predicated only on your God-given value exactly as you are. Let me close with this quote by one of the desert fathers in the 4th century. A man who pioneered what Christians know about silence and solitude and rest. A time is coming when men will go mad. And when they see somebody who is not mad, they will attack him, saying, you are mad. You are not like us. St. Anthony lived in the 4th century. And yet his words echo with a sort of eerie prophecy for our time, don't they? What he's saying is that living differently as a Jesus follower makes you a divisive presence. Being a Jesus follower does not mean that everyone will go, what have you got? Because I want me some of that. No, it means that they'll go, you must be mad because you're not like us. And in a burnout culture is a culture that is gripped by a collective mental disorder. To exhaust yourself spiritually and physically and psychologically because culture tells you that your value is predicated on achievement and performance is a disorder. It is madness. It is insanity. And in that kind of culture, to stop for a second, in that kind of a culture, to live as if the world wouldn't actually stop moving if you did for 5 minutes, that makes you radical. More, it makes you a little bit crazy. It makes you a little bit mad. But maybe, just maybe, you can show the world a better way of being. So listen, this closes our service, and I'd love for you guys to join us next Sunday as we continue to walk through these pieces around stress, exhaustion, burnout. And next Sunday, we're going to talk a little bit about Sabbath and the practice and what that means for us as we seek to live that out in our world. So our service closes now, but if you want to stay, we're going to wrestle through these questions that take us a little bit deeper into our content. How much do you feel affected by burnout culture in your own life? And secondly, how could you practice living differently? This is a conversational space where we always say, The Jesus life is not about information, it's about transformation. And that happens in conversation. It happens in dialogue with one another. Okay, so I encourage you to stick around, wrestle through these questions. If you have to take off, have a safe drive home, and we hope to see you next Sunday. Thanks so much.